Hey folks, Matt Easton here, Scholar Gladiator. So I get inundated with people asking me, Matt, is the Spadroon the greatest type of sword ever invented? And you know, some people think that I hate Spadroons, some people think that I love Spadroons, but actually it's far more complex than that. Spadroons are the sword of their time, okay? They were used all over Europe. This is a British Napoleonic example. This example is actually on for sale on my website at the moment. It's blue and gilt. It's the 1796 pattern infantry, line infantry officer's sword, and this was the default sword for infantry officers in Britain from 1796 until 1822. In actual fact, for certain types of infantry officers, they got a sabre. I've talked about in previous videos, the 1803 pattern. And before that, some officers were using non-regulation sabres. And that's what kind of inspired the 1803 pattern to come along. But only flank officers, that is only officers in charge of companies on the flanks, in a battle as it were, would have sabres because they were deemed more likely to get into hand-to-hand combat, or at least that's my interpretation of the reasoning behind it. But the fact is that Spadroons were popular all over Europe. They were used in France and Prussia and Italy and all over. And they varied in design, and obviously some are better than others. Now, as I've made clear in previous videos, one of the problems of the Spadroon, and I'm going to look at problems, but I'm also going to look at an advantage here, but one of the problems of the Spadroon is that it is a worse cutter than a broadsword, backsword or sabre. Okay, it should, I mean, just looking at the objects should give you a general hint of that. Here's a Napoleonic British 1796 pattern sabre. Which do you think can cut the best? Well, yes, you're correct. Whichever one, I won't say whichever one you think, because some of you crazy people out there will have said this one. But no, the sabre definitely cuts more effectively than the sabre, unexpectedly, for most of us, hopefully. So it's not as good at cutting, but what do you gain by having that? And what do I mean by that? Well, first of all, the blade is more narrow. It's more flexible. We'll talk about flex in a minute, but it's more narrow. It's got less mass at the center of percussion. The way it's balanced, it's generally speaking balanced relatively close to the hand, although that's not necessarily a problem. You can have a sword which is overall heavier and has more mass at the center of percussion and still balances in the same place because of course it might have a heavier hilt. But overall these weapons are quite light. They usually weigh up to about 800 grams. It has to be said, they can be as heavy as a sabre, but they tend in that case to be balanced somewhat differently. They tend to be heavy hilted examples. They can be as light as kind of 600 grams, that kind of range there. I'll just talk very briefly and I'll come back to this. The small sword, for reference, usually weighs around 400 grams, around that point, okay, 400, 500 grams, whereas these usually weigh between 600 and 800 grams, usually sabres of this kind weigh about 800 grams, okay. So the overall weight, they're relatively light weapons, but more than that, it's to do with weight distribution, and a lot of people who don't necessarily know that much about swords, but know a bit about swords, will often describe a sword simply in weight and point of balance, and actually that doesn't tell you very much because inertia is dictated. In other words, how the sword feels in your hand is dictated by the weight distribution. So I could make a sword that weighed 2,000 grams and have an incredibly thin tip and a very light hilt and have all of the mass centered right here, and you would go, oh, it's a 2,000 gram sword, but it balances close to the hand, and it would tell you nothing about how that sword felt in the hand. Incidentally, a 2,000 gram sword that balanced there would feel disgustingly horrible and wouldn't be very usable as a weapon. But the point is that it's far more complex than just simply overall weight and where the point of balance is. We also need to know about weight distribution, and one of the reasons that these Spadroons feel light is because they've got relatively narrow blades in the second half of the blade. So the upper half of the blade, of course it is wider than a small sword, but it is considerably narrower and has less mass in it than a sabre. So for that reason, when you hold the weapon, it feels very nimble in the tip. Now, that's where we come on to the advantage of the Spadroon. So it's very clear that what the Spadroon is an attempt to marry some cutting capacity with a fairly decent thrusting capacity. And I would argue you only have to look at the style of the hilt and then look at a small sword hilt to notice that essentially it's a bit like a scaled up small sword. And so clearly what they were going for with spadroons, sometimes known as shearing swords, incidentally, in the 18th century, is they were trying to make a small sword with some cutting capacity. Okay, and some small swords do have some cutting capacity, but this is a bit more. So they've looked at back swords and they've gone, oh, well, we want to have some ability to slash the back sworder's arms or face or whatever we can reach. And so they've given it what I would call a shearing, as McBain would call it, or slashing edge, okay, which now gives you the ability, when the opportunity arises, while we're predominantly using the point, the ability occasionally to launch a cut in if the opportunity arises, if there's an opening for it. So it gives you another string to your bow, essentially, another weapon in your arsenal. And so therefore, we could say that that's a strength. But I have often made the point in the past that one of the problems with the spadroon is that it's neither as good at cutting as a sabre or a backsword, and not as good at thrusting as a small sword. And indeed, I would maintain that point. I would say that is definitely true. However, the advantage, so what is the advantage of a spadroon? Well, I'm not going to say some of the things you might be thinking. I'm not going to say, oh, it's light and easy to wear and it looks elegant and it reminds someone of the social status of the gentleman and the fact that in civilian life he might wear a small sword, or his accessibility to duelling culture, or anything like this. All of the possible reasons why officers may have carried spadroons, or the government might have wanted them to carry spadroons rather than sabres or backswords and some more practical fighting sword. No, it's not that. It is this. It's that gentlemen of the period, if they learned fencing, usually learned fencing with the foil in preparation for using the small sword. And why did they do that? Well, very much by the 18th century, fencing was inextricably connected to duelling culture. And if anything, it was more connected to duelling culture than it was to military culture. And that's a very important differentiation to make. And when do we first start seeing military manuals start to become popular again? In the Napoleonic Wars. Okay, it was only in the Napoleonic Wars where people started looking at military swordsmanship as a thing distinct, or at least there'd been a pause. They started re-looking at it with an invigorated fervour. They started looking at military swordsmanship as a thing separate to dueling swordsmanship. Okay, and indeed, new weapons started to become popular on foot, and these new manuals came about. For example, Roworth and Angelo and Mathewson came about to cater for these new military foot swords. But prior to that, if you were an late 18th century gentleman and you learnt fencing, you learnt foil fencing. And you learnt foil fencing with the mentality of either doing it as a sport or a gymnastic physical activity, or indeed to prepare you for the duel. And that duel, assuming it wasn't done with a pistol, would be done with a small sword. So, an advantage of the spadroon is that we know from numerous sources, Georgian period, the Duke of Wellington's own letters, in fact, during the occupation of France after the Battle of Waterloo, and indeed later accounts from Colonel King Harman and various other people writing in the Victorian period, that one thing that officers did not like to do was to learn something new. Certainly British officers. British officers are universally criticised by their superiors throughout the 19th century, from the Napoleonic period right the way through to the end of the 19th century, for the fact that they didn't like to learn how to use their weapons. And this wasn't only swords. It wasn't only that British officers were famous for not learning how to use their swords, but they also were famous for not learning how to use their pistols either. Now, of course, there are exceptions. There are, the Hodsons of the world, or the Nicholsons of the world. These people who were excellent shots or excellent with a sword or a lance, and they, like some of us in HEMA, took an abnormal interest in martial culture, and in many cases, were famous single stick players, or took a great interest in learning from the best sort of military swordsmen of the era, or indeed, in Hodson's case, training with his Sikh soldiers, learning how to use the sword and the lance on horseback in the way that they practiced and competing with them at it. Tent pegging and polo and things like this. But most officers did not learn to use their weapons. So, coming back to the 18th century gentleman, if the 18th century gentleman has gone to school and learned foil fencing at school, because that's a thing that gentlemen do, because it's connected to dueling culture and it defines you as a gentleman. If they now find themselves in the army because that's what's socially expected of them, or because their dad's in the army, they're put into the army and they're given a sword, what's the best kind of sword to give them? If they have spent their youth learning how to use a foil, does it make an awful lot of sense to issue them with one of these? No, it doesn't. It doesn't make any sense at all. Now, that's not to say that if you're an experienced person in foil fencing, that you can't apply those skills to the use of the cavalry sabre. Indeed, you can, okay? However, someone who's best suited to using one of these will be someone who's studied the use of one of these, or tangentially single stick. But single stick, ironically, by the Georgian period, was somewhat seen as a rather lower class activity. And while single stick playing, so backswording essentially, was done in villages all over England, and it was to some degree done in the fencing schools, the predominant style of fencing taught to young gentlemen, to boys at public schools like Eton and Harrow and Rugby, was indeed foil fencing. So this young boy, age 18, has gone into the army as a second lieutenant or an ensign, and he's given a sword and he's going to be on foot. Clearly, if he's on horse, then you have to give them something like that, because you're not going to use a Spadroon on horse. But if they're on foot, if they're in the infantry, then the best kind of thing to give them is something that at least they have a slight head start at knowing how to use. And indeed, if you only know foil fencing, you can use a Spadroon exactly like a kind of big and slightly cumbersome small sword. So, I would say that the Spadroon has to be taken in context, okay? If you just compare it to a longsword or a medieval sword, or even the cavalry sabre, then yes, indeed, in most ways it will be found deficient. Not to say it can't compete against them. I do know people, and I have tried myself, to fence Spadroon against sabre. It does okay. Small sword against sabre does surprisingly well. I personally would rather have a well-built small sword than a Spadroon. But maybe that's just me. I don't think it is just me, but by and large, the Spadroon is a weapon which is meant to be put into the hands of infantry officers who, for the most part, don't really know how to sword fight very well, but have probably taken a few years of foil lessons at school or in the army. So they know how to use a foil, so this is a weapon that they can adapt those skills to. And more than that, if you're not a superb fencer, if you're a basic level fencer, and you're given simply a small sword, you might say, why not just give them small swords? If you give them a small sword and now they have to oppose a musket and a bayonet, that's slightly problematic, because the weapon, the small sword, is so light that if someone's swinging a cavalry sword at me or thrusting a musket with a bayonet on the end at me, it's very difficult to oppose with such a light weapon. So what the Spadroon does is it gives essentially the foilist, imagine a modern sport fencing foilist, thrown into the Napoleonic army. It gives them a fighting chance because they can use the weapon more or less like a foil, but equally because it's beefier and heavier and slightly bigger in the hilt, it gives them a fighting chance against bayonets and cavalry swords and sabres and other things that they're going to meet. So in actual fact, perhaps, in a way, the Spadroon was perfectly suited for the people that it was not issued to, but made regulation for, because just to explain the difference, officers buy their own weapons. I'm sure many of you know that. So they're not issued the sword, but they're told what type of sword to buy. So maybe it is the perfect type of sword for the Napoleonic gentleman. And what's interesting is that in Britain, we did in fact, for infantry officers, just the same as in many other countries, move to the sabre. And it's quite remarkable, I think anyway, that after the Napoleonic period we see sabre fencing and single stick seems to have a revival of practice, and this is what enables you to give your infantry officers the sabre, because you're now making them practice with a single stick, so that makes sense. Until single stick or sabre practice becomes regulation, until that point you can only at best hope that they know how to use a foil. Hence, you give them the Spadroon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon and you can follow us on Facebook.